What's going on, guys? Coach Miles here for my performance, and for this Whiteboard Wednesday, we're discussing Omni Contraction periodization, an alternative triphasic training approach. So many coaches out there, and even many athletes at this point, have likely now heard of and possibly even implemented Caldece's triphasic training principles with great success, and we will now look at another successful system that shares some similarities. So what is Omni Contraction periodization? Well, it's block-style periodization that emphasizes training all muscle contraction types concomitantly, so using a variety of block-relevant techniques to do so. As you'll see in the coming slides, we must remember that all muscle action during athletic endeavors is triphasic in nature, having an eccentric, isometric, and concentric phase. Because of this, the theory of omni-contraction periodization is that all three muscle contraction types should be trained simultaneously throughout all training programs, as they're equally important. Two popular coaches in the field who've used these principles that we have to give credit to are Thibaudeau and Prentiss. They both taught us about these principles and used them with much success, so all the credit goes to them. So the primary training phases are accumulation, which is a block of training consisting of higher volume and lower intensity work. It's typically intended to promote hypertrophy, reinforce tendon quality, and ameliorate exercise technique. This is typically followed by intensification, which is a block of training consisting of higher intensity and lower volume work, typically intended to promote maximal strength, which will serve as a foundation for the upcoming realization block. And finally, the realization block. This block of training is used to transfer the strength built during intensification phases into the ability to produce maximum power or speed. So we'll now look at the contraction-specific training methods. So as far as eccentrics go, we have slow eccentrics, where each rep has a 4 to 10 second eccentric, and we're looking at 30 to 60 seconds time under tension per set. Accentuated eccentrics, lowering very heavy weights with a slow eccentric and exploding up, or even better, supramaximal eccentrics, loading up to more than 100% of our 1RM, lowering as slow as possible, and then exploding up. Obviously, in this case, we would need weight releasers. And finally, overspeed eccentrics. So bands attached to the bar, causing that hypergravity effect, or shock training, right? So plyometrics, having that rapid eccentric stretch, followed by that explosive concentric contraction. Now, in regard to isometrics, we have our pure yielding isometrics, which is holding a body weight or a load until failure at a specific joint angle. Or we could also do intra-set statodynamic pauses. So pauses throughout the range of motion, whether that's during the eccentric or during the concentric phase, depending on your goal. Overcoming isometrics, pulling or pushing against an immovable object, so typically against the pins on a power rack, whether that's a deadlift or a bench or any other exercise. And then rapid isometrics, so we have drop-catch isometrics, where we pull ourselves down to the bottom of the exercise as fast as possible, slam the brakes, and then explode back up. We have our isometronics and altitude landings as well. Now for concentrics, we have a variety of different methods we can use. So normal reps, we could use our typical hypertrophy set rep schemes for accumulation, our typical strength set and rep schemes for intensification. During accumulation, we may use the 80-60 drop set technique, 90-70 drop set during intensification. We could use clusters for both accumulation and intensification. Even realization, we could do mechanical advantage drop sets during accumulation phases. Or also we could do pure concentrics. Typically it would be more of an intensification method. And again, that's like a inertia bench or squat, or you might call it Anderson bench or squat, bottoms up, whatever you want to call it. But starting on the pins, starting with the concentric first, so no eccentric stretch or anything like that. And just that pure concentric, working on that starting strength and the ability to accelerate off the pins. Varied reps, so we could do double contraction method, whether that's 1 1/4 reps or 1 1/2 reps. So again, typically add a pulse or a half rep or a quarter rep at the weak point of the exercise. So 1 rep of your bench press might look like down all the way, quarter of the way up, back down to the chest, and then all the way up, and that's constituting 1 rep. Explosive concentric, so traditional exercises done with maximal acceleration. This is your classic West Side dynamic effort barbell lifting. You could have your Olympic weightlifting exercises. You could have jumps, plyometrics, loaded jumps, and throws as well. So now we'll look at these training blocks applied. So now, during each block of training, which methods are we going to use to train each contraction type? So during accumulation phases, as we've kind of alluded to, we would have our slow eccentric. So then again, that was 4 to 10 seconds per rep, looking for 30 to 60 seconds time under tension per set. Our isometrics, typically we're going to look at our pure yielding isometrics or intra-set statodynamic pauses. Something like an overcoming isometric, as you'll see shortly, doesn't really fit here because, again, it's not as much of a hypertrophy-inducing method, and it's more for the neural aspect. Concentric, again, obviously we could have normal reps, as we mentioned before, with those specific percentages. And again, varied reps, so we could have those 1.5 or 1.25 reps at appropriate percentages here as well. Moving on to an intensification block. During the eccentric, we primarily are looking at accentuated eccentrics. So handling weights as heavy as we can with slow eccentrics and then exploding up, or for the advanced athlete, and if we have access to them, we could even use super maximal eccentrics like weight releasers, for example. Okay, moving on to the isometrics. Again, as we mentioned, overcoming isometrics, not great for putting on a lot of size, but they will be an amazing tool we can use for the neural adaptations that we can incur from them. So again, typically you want to work at or slightly below your sticking point, pushing or pulling against the pins for sets of anywhere from 3 seconds to typically 6 seconds, but that can all vary, of course. And again, that's going to be a high neural stimulus, so that works very well during intensification phases. Intraset statodynamic pauses, so again, pausing throughout the eccentric or the concentric. Typically, eccentric pauses are better for accumulation or for building muscle, and concentric pauses are better for intensification phases or blowing through those sticking points, right? Building strength. Those aren't hard and fast rules, but they're just kind of guidelines that you may want to use. And concentric, again, normal reps, but obviously much heavier percentages than we used over there on the left in the accumulation block, and the same thing with the varied reps. We could still use 1.25 or 1.5 rep protocols, but the weights will be much heavier, the volumes will be much lower. Now, realization, typically for the eccentrics, we're looking at overspeed eccentrics, whether that's use of bands to induce hypergravity or plyometrics, otherwise known as shock training. Typically, those are the eccentrics we're going to be using, right? The realization phase is all about power, so we want to focus on speed on almost everything we do. So again, that's still an eccentric. This is where a lot of people get confused. Just because we're training the eccentrics doesn't mean it has to be slowly, right? Now we're actually purposefully training the eccentric quickly so we can improve our reactivity or our ability to switch from eccentric to isometric to concentric, okay? So as far as isometrics go, rapid isometrics are going to be huge here. That's going to be our altitude landings, and then obviously our drop catch isometrics as well. Pulling yourself down, slamming on the brakes, and then being able to explode back. And finally, for concentrics, explosive concentrics will be huge here. Again, our jumps, our throws, our loaded jumps, our Olympic lifting, our dynamic effort barbell lifting. Accommodating resistance is a huge benefit here as well. That just all depends on what you have access to, training age of your athletes, and multiple other factors like time available, training age, and things like that. So now, Omni Contraction versus Triphasic. So aren't they the same thing? You may think so initially, but there are some similarities and some differences, okay? So similarities, right, starting in the middle, both use block periodization strategies. So in other words, they're focused on one or a few qualities at a time as opposed to a concurrent model like the typical conjugate model that we've spoken about in the past. We're developing all qualities at once. Another similarity is that all contraction types are emphasized. So many programs, especially your traditional linear program, focuses solely on the concentric contraction and simply lifting the weight while adjusting volume and intensity over time, which may be good for beginners, but eventually it makes sense to begin emphasizing all these different muscle contractions in different ways for holistic athlete development. So there are just some differences here. Triphasic, one contraction type is emphasized per block. So as Coach Dietz kind of jokes, if you don't want to buy his book, he doesn't care. Do 2 weeks of heavy eccentric loading, 2 weeks of heavy isometric loading, 2 of heavy concentric loading, and then figure out the rest, right? So all jokes aside, his structure is typically linear in the sense that it goes high force, low velocity, then high force, high velocity, then low force, high velocity, as he progresses throughout the offseason, coming from early offseason to that preseason or pre-competition peak. Okay? With the Omni Contraction method, all contraction types are emphasized during each training block. So that is one spot where it differs. And again, typically we'll periodize it a little bit more specifically based on each athlete's needs. So typically, that triphasic training will go from heavy to light, as we just kind of discussed over here, with the 1, 2, 3 over on the left. It's much more dependent on what the athlete needs in the Omni Contraction system, in the sense that some basic guidelines are, if you have an athlete that has, less muscle mass or less time with training, lower training age, they're going to spend more time in accumulation phases. An athlete that has some of that time under their belt but still isn't that strong, more in intensification. And an athlete that has a high level of mass and strength will want to spend some more time in the realization phases. So again, that programming and how much time you allocate to each type of block kind of depends on that athlete's individual needs and abilities. And even within that, you may choose to progress those linearly, as Cal does over there on the left, or you could undulate them. So you may, for example, With an athlete that has a high level of mass and strength, you may go one accumulation block just to get them ready for the upcoming workloads, then intensification, then realization, then intensification again, and then finish out with the realization. So there could be some undulation in there as well. That's it for today, guys. Again, this presentation is not meant to be which system is better or worse. These are some excellent coaches that have had some incredible success with these systems over the years. So really all we're trying to do here is expose you guys to different systems so you know what's out there, and then you could use your professional judgment to figure out what's best for you in your context, okay? And then apply it as you see fit. So thanks again for watching. Happy Whiteboard Wednesday. Feel free to hit us up on any social media here, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, if you have any questions, or email. We'd love to hear from you. Take care.